Hi there, my name is Ryan Estrellado, and I'm an author and an educator, and I wrote a book called the K-12 Educator's Data Guidebook, and this is the introduction to the virtual book club that we'll be participating in together. One thing that happened with me is I learned that the more and more technical I got, the harder it was for me to collaborate with folks who weren't using the same kinds of tools. And the reason why is because I didn't change the way I talked about data. In some ways, I got a little too far away from what data is actually for, which is to support decision-making about how we serve our students. And so the question that I started asking myself is, there must be some way to bridge that gap between what we do with really sophisticated tools and how we work with a larger audience of people who are looking to serve students. That is my big why for using data, learning about data, and building community with y'all about how we can talk about data in a way that serves students, families, and schools. I want to ask you to take a brief moment before you continue on, hit pause if you need to think to yourself, what is your why for using data? Okay, so if you're watching this video, then you are probably going to be starting the virtual book club for the K-12 Educator's Data Guidebook, a book I wrote in March 2022. But before we jump into the chapter content, I want to give you an introduction about what this virtual book club is about and a little bit about why I wrote the book. This virtual book club has two parts to it. Super simple. Number one, the part where you read a chapter, and then number two, the part where we participate in a virtual and asynchronous online discussion about the concepts in the chapter. You'll use a worksheet that I've created for you to draft your own schedule for how you participate, and also use for reflection and a guide to get the most out of this virtual book club. I designed this virtual book club for people like you and for people like me, busy people with full-time jobs. And the way that I did it is I set it up with some structure so that we can hold ourselves accountable to learn as much as we can from each other, but also with lots of choices about when you participate. Watching the video like this one, going through the worksheet, that'll all be done offline. Reading the book will also be done offline. There'll be 2 weeks of asynchronous online interaction where you'll be posting reactions to the book's chapter that we're talking about, answering reflection questions, and having discussions with other people. I will be logging onto the chat at least once a day, if not more, to answer questions, to weigh in with my thoughts, to react to all the different perspectives that I hope we get to see, and to have conversation and be in community with y'all about the different ways that we can use data to support our students in schools. All right, that's all for now. I hope this introduction gave you some context about what this work is going to be all about. I hope that y'all have fun. I hope I see you in the chat. And let's jump into the chapter content. Talk to you soon. So this is a video on chapter 3 of the K-12 Educator's Data Guidebook, and that chapter is called Rewriting Your Data Story. My name is Ryan Estrellado, and I'm the author of the K-12 Educator's Data Guidebook. Okay, so in this chapter, I want to introduce what might be a new idea to you, which is how important psychological safety is when we are talking about data in schools. Look, I know that this idea might sound weird because when we think about data, we often think about numbers and spreadsheets, and indeed, those are part of doing good data work in schools. I talk a lot about those more technical elements in the book. But one thing that I've learned from listening to your stories, so that's you, the educator, teachers, school psychologists, service providers, is that data is not just a numbers problem with numbers solutions, but they are also people-related problems with people-related solutions. And those are the things that I put up front in the book deliberately because I don't think we talk about them enough. Okay, so first I want to talk about what psychological safety means. Psychological safety is a phrase that's been around for a long time, but in the context of working in schools, and in particular working with data in schools, it has to do with feeling safe enough to be vulnerable in sharing. We'll talk about some examples in a moment. And when we share enough, having the safety to allow trust to build with our teammates that we are analyzing data with, so that as the trust builds, we reaffirm our own personal integrity about why we use data in schools and how we use data in schools. And in doing school data in a way that fosters psychological safety, we in turn foster these three elements: vulnerability in sharing, trusting each other, and affirming our personal integrity, both individually, but also collectively as an organization. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit out of the book to talk more about this idea of vulnerability and sharing data. This is from chapter 3 on page 31. Sharing data from your classroom or school isn't just sharing numbers. It's a way of sharing the product of your hard work. And if you're like me, sharing your work feels vulnerable. It's taking an object you put your heart and soul into, like a painting, an essay, or a meal, and putting it in front of everyone. It is a vulnerable act. There were so many stories that people shared with me as I was researching this book about what it feels like to share data, and those feelings weren't always good. And I think that's because when you are sharing data about a student, it is a reflection of your work. In a lot of ways, it is a record of your work. And so it feels vulnerable to share that in front of other people, whether that be the results of a lesson from a teacher, or a psychoeducational evaluation at an IEP from a school psychologist, or test scores from a principal. Those are all records of our work, and thus it can be very difficult to share. So for as much as we talk about how important data-driven decision-making is, it's very hard to do if we don't have an environment that honors how hard it is to share and creates a sense of safety when we share it. Okay, so that's the concept. Let's get practical. In chapter 3 of the K-12 Educator's Data Guidebook, on page 33, I share some steps to develop norms for sharing data that should support psychological safety and thus make it easier to share so that you can make the best data-driven decisions for your students. There are two parts to doing this. First, in order to create norms that create the kind of data sharing environment you want, you have to be able to imagine the kind of data sharing environment you want. Try this exercise to imagine what the ideal data sharing environment would be like for you. Complete this sentence. First one, when we talk about data, I want to learn more about blank. How would you finish that sentence? Second one, when we talk about data, I don't want to feel worried that blank. Again, how would you finish that sentence? And finally, I make the best decisions for my students when blank. How would you finish that sentence? Okay, so here's the problem with norms. We can make the most beautiful, clearly articulated norms, put it on the nicest poster paper that we can, hang them in our meetings, but if we don't know what it looks like to express those norms through behaviors, then it's just going to be a nice poster. So we have to talk about what it looks like. And that's what we're going to do in this next part. For each of your ideal data sharing statements, write a behavior that describes what it would look like to express that statement. Here are some examples from the book. Again, I'm reading here from page 33. All right, example number 1. A week before each meeting, our team begins to gather information to bring and discuss. Example number 2. When someone needs help gathering and understanding data, we meet them where they are and we learn together. And finally, example number 3. When tense situations arise, we avoid blaming someone and focus on how our team is positioned to improve. When you've written your own statements about what an ideal data sharing environment looks like, and you come up with descriptions of what it looks like to express those ideal statements, you've got everything that you need to begin developing a positive data culture that nurtures psychological safety. And I promise when you have that, you will have a lot more sharing. And when you have a lot more sharing, you'll have a lot more conversations driven by data that you can use to make the best decisions that you can for your students, which in the end is what all of this is about. Okay, so we talked about psychological safety, what it is and why it's important. We talked about how it can build a data sharing environment that can lead you along a path to better data-driven decision-making and a more positive data culture. Now, as you reflect on these questions, write them down in your notebook. This is going to be really important because as you enter into the virtual chat part of our book club, these are some of the ideas that you can express and share with others as you have conversations to learn about what this could look like in real life. Reflection question number 1. What about the idea of psychological safety and data sharing excites you? Question number 2. What do you find worrisome about using these ideas about psychological safety in your school in a real life setting? Next question. What do you need to understand this idea better? And in particular, how to make a more positive, psychologically safe data culture in your school? And last, what's your current stance on this idea? Where do you sit with it? Are you ready to try it? Are you still worried about some things? Do you need to talk to somebody to brainstorm more about what it could look like? Just get clear about where you're at with it. I hope that this video and the reflection questions help you get ready to take your ideas into the virtual chat where we'll be talking with each other about what this looks like in real life, answering all kinds of questions, sharing the ideas that we've experienced in our own personal and professional life, and overall collaborating together in a virtual space to learn more about how we can build a positive and psychologically safe data sharing culture in our schools. I'll see you in the chat.